Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And Zaid, thank you for the introduction. Um, First, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to moderate the session, and also Tan Sri uh, Michael Yeo and Dr. Sri Iqbal, my former lecturer in the university. And I also like to see all of you this morning. Welcome to this forum this morning. I think the two speakers, the opening remarks, and also the welcome remarks by Tan Sri Michael Yeo and Dr. Sri Iqbal actually has set the framework for today's discussion and actually fits very well moving into this topic this morning. As you know, Tan Sri Michael Yeo mentioned about the three C's and the issues and four R's. I mean, that's a great start. And of course, Dr. Sri, as usual, painted a fantastic and very balanced picture of what is going to happen and what could happen, and also the implications for Malaysia. And it's a great place to take off. And I don't want to linger further, except just to say that, as we know, the global and financial system has gone through a massive turbulence since the COVID pandemic in 2020. And of course, we saw recovery setting in at the end of 2021 and also in 2022. And of course, we also see that the global economy and many countries have done well, including Malaysia. But we also note that the recovery has not been even throughout the regions and countries. And coming out of the pandemic, it is not a great time because in 2022 we had different headwinds emerging. That is as you all know, the famous Ukraine and Russia war. And we also have the issue of supply chain disruptions and subsequent increase in cost of living, inflation, and also a tight policy framework, which is actually beginning to constrain growth in many economies. As you see, the general consensus among economists and also the international institutions is that while we've seen good recovery in 22, we are going to see some softening of economic growth in 2023. And of course, Malaysia being an open economy, we're not going to be spared from what is happening internationally and globally. And let me just introduce the four very distinguished panelists which you have this morning. On my extreme right is Prof. Geoffrey Williams. Professor Geoffrey is currently Professor and Provost for Research and in the Malaysian University of Science and Technology, MAS. He's also a Senior Fellow of Malaysian Institute of Economic Research. He also has to his credit recent books published, which include Responsible Management in Asia, Perspectives on CSR and Advancing Innovation and Sustainable Outcomes. And beside me is Dr. Kirida, Director of TDRI, Economic Intelligence Services, Thailand Development Research Institute. She's also served as a senior economist and country economist for the World Bank in Thailand, and has been the author of the Thailand Economic Monitor, a biannual publication of the World Bank. And she's an expert in the area for Asia as well. And on my immediate left is Suhaimie. He's head of economic research in Kenanga Investment Bank. He has extensive experience and knowledge of financial markets, including in journalism and economic investment research and equity analyst. Having worked abroad in Malaysia for over 30 years, he looks very young for 30 years. And from extreme left is Dr. Sankaran Nambiar, a senior research fellow and head of research MIER. He's also a visiting fellow at the Crawford School of Public Policy and Australian National University, and a member of the Academic and Advisory Council of Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia. Now let me invite each of the panelists to provide a preliminary perspective of the global economic and financial scenario for 2023, the attendant challenges which are going to face. Not only challenges, but along with challenges, there will also be opportunities for us to look at. And what we'll do is, after the preliminary presentation, We'll have at least another 2 rounds of discussion among the panelists, and after which we'll open the floor for the delegates to ask questions and provide comments. Thank you. With that, if I can start from my extreme right, invite Prof. Geoffrey to start with your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. No PowerPoint slides today. You just have to listen to me. So thank you very much. Thank you, Tantri, for inviting me, everybody from KSI. It's nice to meet, I think, everybody physically. I think the last time I attended a forum like this with KSI was online, wasn't it? I think so. It's nice to have these events now. So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to give you a very brief overview. Dato, please stop me if you want, because I know we have quite a lot of time. So yes, by all means, because there will be several rounds and then we can discuss, and please feel free to ask any questions later on. In terms of the general global business environment or global economic environment, of course, we have to set the scene in terms of the global geopolitical environment and the main risks and the main opportunities that that's going to offer to us. So I'm pretty sure that everybody will have a similar view to me, and that's also, Dr. Sri has already highlighted some of these issues. Of course, some of the main geopolitical risks are, number one, the war in the Ukraine, which is, as was mentioned tomorrow, I think, unfortunately, is the anniversary of the beginning of that terrible conflict. And that's a conflict which is lasting very much longer than we expected, and the prospect for escalation is clear with the visit of Biden to Ukraine and also in Europe, and now discussions in Europe about escalating the military assistance, even from the United Kingdom, providing aircraft support. What aircraft we have left in the United Kingdom, I don't know. I leave that to the Prime Minister, but perhaps he wants to restock the aircraft or whatever it is. But nonetheless, that is a significant escalation there. Somebody asked me yesterday, what is the impact of that here in Malaysia? And the answer, I have to say, is I don't know specifically, except through the effect on the global environment. So clearly there is so that's not a direct effect, it's an indirect effect. Hopefully some of the other panelists might have some better ideas about the direct effect. But that signals the biggest challenge, I think, for Malaysia this year is what's going to happen in the global economic environment as a whole. Already in January, we have seen reductions in our exports in the January figures. This part looks as if it's developing, unfortunately, into a bit of a downtrend. And that will reflect the overall strength of the global economy. The IMF have been very gloomy up until December, but then fortunately in January we had what I consider to be the second biggest impact in terms of the global scenario, which was the change in policy in China. So we had been expecting for a continuation of the zero COVID lockdowns. Now, of course, that has changed, and that's, in my view, affecting the global possibilities in a very positive way, particularly for Malaysia and ASEAN as a whole. Because it very much changes the prospects in terms, of course, trade and investment, and then also the more directly in terms of tourism and consumption, from which there is already some signs. And if you go to Bukit Bintang or around pavilions and so on, it appears to me very much like it used to be before the pandemic. It's very busy and very active, and that's a very good thing. And that's a sort of visual indicator of what we will expect to see in terms of the global economy, the effect of the opening up of China on the regional and global economy, which is positive. So even the very gloomy predictions of the IMF and World Bank have now all been revised. They're still pretty gloomy, but they're not quite as gloomy as they were before. But my view is that is very positive for Malaysia, because Malaysia's growth, and certainly export growth and investment, is largely ASEAN and China. So if we look at the prospects for North America and Europe, they are still very gloomy for various reasons. And many people, I believe, overstate the effect of China and Europe in terms of its effect on Malaysia. They are important markets for us. But the biggest markets by far are here in the ASEAN region and in the Asian region. So the opening up of China certainly changes that view in terms of what's going to happen here in Malaysia. The next big thing, of course, is political stability, which will have an important impact in terms of setting the overall global environment. Political stability in North America, in the United States in particular, but also I think in Canada. People often miss out Canada, but that's actually very difficult and very unstable environment in Canada. But of course, most people are concerned about America and of course the political stability in Europe. These, I think, are affected by many indicators, not least will be the conflict in the Ukraine. That will have a significant effect on the political stability in both of those regions. The effect of that on Malaysia, well, this again is a knock-on effect. There's nothing that Malaysia can do about these things except to be aware of it and acknowledge it and anticipate it as much as possible. What that means to me is that going forward into 2023 and the budget tomorrow, there must be a very solid focus on the domestic economy, given that we have a number of quite serious, in my view, headwinds in terms of the global economy. So we would hope that the budget would focus on building resilience in the domestic economy. To me, that would be resilience in terms of incomes for consumers, resilience in terms of investment from businesses, and particularly the SME sector, which are 98% of all companies. There's something that I think many people don't quite understand, is that out of that 98% of companies, 78% of those companies are very small micro enterprises, 5 employees or smaller. And that means that changing the environment in the budget on tomorrow to help those people is, I think, a very important signal in terms of the prospects for the economy during the next year, and of course the fiscal issue. I'm actually quite neutral on the government's position or the overall position on debt and deficit. I don't at all see that this is an urgent issue. It's important to highlight it, not because it represents a particular crisis point, but because it's a signal that you have to improve and clear up and clean up the spending side, removing the wastage, removing the corruption, getting more money more value from your money. That side has to be improved, and the tax collection side and the revenue collection side. So what I expect to see tomorrow in the budget will be a greater emphasis on what you often call fiscal prudence or fiscal conservatism rather than austerity, which is simply to clean that up first. And my hope would be that the government can spend a great deal of time cleaning it up and then move on to a significant reform agenda, which will be necessary for, not tomorrow, but will be necessary for the next 3 years and 5 years. That's it for me in terms of the opening. If you want to talk about domestic political stability, I'm happy to talk about that, but perhaps in the Q&A.
Thank you, Prof. Prof. Geoffrey, in fact, highlighted some positive, which is the opening up of China, which could change the landscape, especially for this region, including Malaysia. And I also talked about the importance of political stability and what is shaping up in Europe and North America, which is not being noticed. They also talked about what Malaysia could do, not worrying so much for the debt, but still, I believe, we can use the word having an expansionary budget, continue to have an expansionary budget this year for 2023. With that, maybe in the next round we can look at other things. With that, could I invite Dr. Kirida, and she will specifically look at the implications more of the region and what is happening in the region, being a really good expert in South Asia and East Asia, which actually will have a lot of implications for Malaysia and especially, and also the global economy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yogis. Again, good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be back here. I'd like to really thank the KSI and the Malaysia Global Business Council for inviting me. I was in KL 6 years ago, so this is such a great opportunity to be back, and it brings lots of good memories here. So I really appreciate being here, and I like what Datuk said, to give you sort of a big picture of how we see the global economy, and probably not just for this year, but some of the mega trends that we see that will affect the global economy going forward as well. Datuk gave me 8 minutes to speak in this first round, so I'd like to probably give you the highlights first of how we see the global economy and some of the mega trends, including risks and opportunities, and then in the subsequent rounds, we can talk more about the details. So if you ask me, how do I see the global economy after the COVID pandemic and also after the Ukraine war, I think the world has become a more gloomy place. Well, that's for sure, because the global economy has now slowed down. And if you look at the projections, as Professor said, from the IMF, from the World Bank, it's probably better than in October and November, but the growth this year is still pretty low compared to previous years and also compared to our projections. So of course, one of the biggest risks I see this year is the global recession. And a recession doesn't mean a contraction. It means that the global economy will grow very slowly, especially in the big countries, right? In the US, in the European Union, in Japan. The only bright star we see this year is probably China. So on the growth story of the global economy, right, it's China that is going to be the big hope of our global economy this year. So I think that's one thing to highlight. But of course, other than growth, there is other factors that will affect businesses, such as inflation, interest rates, exchange rates, right? So how do we see that? Of course, with the inflation rising due to energy prices rising, due to other commodity prices rising, including food and fertilizers, these have kept prices high. And if you see the figures for inflation forecast for this year or even next year, it's still a positive inflation, right? It means that prices are still going up. So we'll be living in an environment with high prices for another at least a year or two. And the war in Ukraine is not going to end anytime soon. I've read many analysis by political analysts, and at least for the whole year of this year, the war will still go on, right? So these will still keep commodity prices high for the rest of the year as well. So definitely, prices will remain high, and with the high prices, right, many countries see the need to increase or raise interest rates in order to fight inflation, including the US. So for example, this year we will see the US policy rate going up, and probably peaking at around over 5%, and it will be kept there until the rest of the year. So the recent forecast is that the policy rate in the US will probably peak in May, and it will remain so until the rest of the year at over 5%, 5.25 to 5.5%. So that's pretty high. And that probably will lead to an increase in interest rates in other developing countries who fears capital outflows, right? So they will be raising the interest rates too. So the global environment for interest rates this year will be a rising interest rate. And I don't believe that we'll go back to the low interest rates that we saw pre-COVID. So we'll be living with 1, high prices, 2, higher interest rates for a while, right? And of course, third is exchange rates. Exchange rates will be volatile because usually when we look at exchange rate, we compare it to the US dollar. And the US dollar will be volatile. It seems to have appreciated a lot last year, right, when the policy rates in the US went up. But at the end of last year, it started coming down. So that's why we saw many of our currencies here strengthening. And it seems like this year, it would probably, so far the US dollar has depreciated or weakened a little bit more. But given that now the Fed says that, we will be tough on inflation, we will raise our policy rate, it seems like the market thinks, oh, okay, interest rates will be higher than we think. So money could flow back to the US and the US dollar could strengthen again, right? So it's going to be very volatile in terms of exchange rate. So you have to brace yourselves for that as well. So on the macroeconomic front, that's how I see growth, inflation, interest rate, and exchange rate. Now, let me come to the more longer term issue that I see other than these macroeconomic factors this year. Those are the mega trends for the world that I see beyond this year. And I think there are 3 key mega trends. There are many more, But the three key megatrends I'd like to highlight, one is that, as Professor said, geopolitical tensions will be here to stay, especially between the US and China. And that has many implications for countries in Southeast Asia as well, because we're a small open economy. We will be affected by that. I'll highlight some of those impacts in a little bit, but let me go through the mega trends that I see. So one is the geopolitical tension. Two is, of course, the speeding up of digitalization, right? I think that will have a big impact, on every economy here, including trade as well, because services trade is something that was difficult in the past, but with digital technology, this could speed up digital, services trade as well. Third mega trend that we see, of course, is the climate change, right? The reduction of carbon, going more green. That is a trend that's here to stay. So I think those are the three big trends. Of course, there are others that have been there for a long time, like urbanization or aging societies. Those have been there even pre-COVID. But I think these three trends have actually emerged more strongly after COVID and after the Ukraine war. So just let me highlight the impacts of each quickly before we can go into more details in the second and third rounds. So for the first megatrend, the geopolitical tensions, right? Especially between US and China. Now, I think it's here to stay because US will not back down on China, and China will keep continuing to develop itself, its technology, and its influence in the world. So one of the impacts that I definitely see is the reconfiguration of many markets, right? One market is the production market, right? There's now friendshoring, there's now onshoring. So the supply chains of the world will definitely be affected. And of course, we in Southeast Asia are an important part of that global supply chain, whether it be the US or China. So we will be impacted as well, right? The second impact is about technology. The technology in the world in the future, we think, will be divided into two camps, the US camp and the Chinese camp. And we're in the middle. So which technology do we choose to use, right? The semiconductor shortage that has happened, that's part of that's one of the results of this geopolitical tensions as well on the technology war that's being waged between the two sides. That's one impact we already see, right? The other impact could be on telecommunications in the future. If the systems are separated, what do we do? Do we hold two phones? Do we put two systems in our companies in order to communicate with both camps? So that is an additional cost, right, to companies as well. So I think there is a reconfiguration of the supply chains, of technology, supply side. There will be also reconfiguration of the energy markets, for example, and this is mainly the result of the Ukraine war. Natural gas markets will be reconfigured, right, because Russia is no longer big in this game anymore. So there'll be so many reconfigurations that'll be going on that will definitely affect us here in this region. Sorry, I ran out of time. We'll go quickly through the two other mega trends. Of course, digitalization, I mentioned briefly, will be here to stay as well. And that opens up so many opportunities, right, for businesses, for households, for the government as well. And I think that will, have a big impact on us. I won't go too much on this on the first round, but as I mentioned earlier, I think there's a lot of scope for services trade going forward, taking advantage of the digital advancements in many of the countries around the world. And lastly, on climate change, I think this is here to stay. Although people say that during this transition period, many countries are going back to coal or going back to nuclear, but eventually renewable energy will come. The development of clean energy is still there. So there will be many more regulations on lower carbon in the future, especially by the European Union. That we have to all be prepared for, right? Especially the carbon tax that the European Union is going to put out, the CBAM, the carbon border tax. These will definitely affect us, and it will not stop easily. But again, I also see many opportunities, right, around being in the low carbon world. There is definitely opportunities for the carbon credit trade. There's opportunities for even just being a consultant, being in this area. Many companies will come to you to get inputs for that, right? Or even products that we produce. For example, like in Thailand, just give you an example of Thailand because I know it most, we are now moving towards more of the production of bioproducts because it's high value added, it's clean, right? It's low carbon, and actually it's very popular among those who are health conscious, especially those who are in countries where the population is a bit older. So, and usually those countries are countries that are developed, in the West and also in Japan, of course, Singapore, even here in Malaysia as well. It's in demand, and we have a lot of agricultural produce as raw materials. So, why not, go and take advantage of that, of those productions. So, just to sum up, I think there are many risks that we will see in the global economy going forward. But at the same time, I think with many of these mega trends, we also see opportunities as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kirida. Sorry for compressing the time. Now you have another chance again later. I think what I'd like to just take away from there is, I think a very important fact is many of us fear that fear of the recession. Recession meaning, the other context is contraction. But here, I think, as Dr. Kirida said, and of course, as the papers are coming out recently, hopefully we're not going to see a contraction in the economy, right? Rather a slow deceleration in growth. That is kind of at least consoling, At least we don't go into a real contraction of the economy. I think that's a very important point to take away. And of course, the mega trends which you mentioned are very important things which are going to change the whole landscape of how countries have to respond and react if they want to stay in place. And the very important word mentioned this morning is competitiveness. You want to be competitive, you want to be in the game, you have to respond to all this. Okay, without much ado, could I invite Suhaimie, if they want to say anything?
Thank you, Dr. Yogis. Assalamualaikum. Thank you very much, KSI, for inviting me, Tan Sri and Datuk Sri. Okay, it's very interesting to hear from my distinguished panelists, their points and all those things. Let me add. Let me go into the Malaysian context of what we should expect. I think. I hope if we get it right this time for Malaysia, I think if we get our act together, I think it will be we will be at the cusp of another takeoff for the Malaysian economy. Hopefully it could be kick off with the budget tomorrow, with the introduction of what Datuk Sri Anwar Bahir would say, the introduction of the Madani Development Mission. Okay, so the concept is simple. Integrity, ethics, equity. Basically, it's a universal concept that we all need to do, in order to achieve the potential growth in the years ahead. If we remember correctly, back during the first takeoff for Malaysia in 1988 to 1997, before the financial crisis, at that time, of course, Datuk Sri Anwar was also the finance minister. It was a tremendous, growth both in the economy as well as the financial market. And I, as a young journalist at that time, was as a business reporter for a local English daily. Every time you hear analysts recommended a stock, or somebody talking about MOU, prices will go up, right? I think those days are over, because nowadays, my observation is as an economist as well as an analyst, it's difficult, it's overwhelming, because there's so many factors affecting the global economy that affects the local economy. So, and we can't run away from it, and we have to be very creative, we have to be very innovative in order for us to go to the next level, in order for us to create, like what Abraham Lincoln said, in order for us to predict the future, we have to create one, right? So as long as we become a nation that only follow, only come up with concept, and without doing, and also most importantly, know what not to do. Because all this while we've been doing something that is dragging the economy back down to the ground. And whether we realize it or not, it affects the next generation. And back in 1998, 97, I remember there was a very tumultuous time where Malaysian politics was also, becoming very tense. And lo and behold, Datuk Seri Anwar was jailed, was sacked, and was jailed. And now he becomes our finance minister again, our prime minister. And I think there is some hope in that he could do something about it. And with it, and it doesn't need to be something so complicated. It only needs to be done. Well, I think what he trying to do now is to remove the systemic problem, the corruption, which is a systemic problem for Malaysia. I think that's the biggest problem. And the other thing is to make sure that, the wealth of the nation will be well distributed. And we can't avoid there will be, different levels of income, of people in different level of income. But the most important part of it is to create opportunity. And I think the only way to do so is by way of education. Invest a lot in education, right? Upskilling for those who are already in the, in their mid-career, you need to upskill because AI is coming. Like what Dr. Kirida mentioned just now, digitalization. That would take us to the next level. That will increase our total factor productivity in the economic balance, basically to improve productivity. So without the commitment from the government to ensure there is enough skilled labor or skilled professionals, graduates, to fill the demand for the growing digital economy, I think we cannot go to the next level. So this is crucial, no matter what. It's not the big projects, the big mega projects, MRT3 or whatever it is. That's important, of course, for infrastructure, but it's the soft, the soft skill that we need. I mean, the technological skills to uplift not only the skill set, but also the income level. I think we are losing out a lot of our good people, our very smart, the brains to our neighbors, to they've been migrating. I've seen a lot in that, and I think this is the time that we need to do something about it. And I think with globalization is going to be back, although it's been put on pause for a while. But I think that is coming by way of digitalization, by way of. I mean, I'm talking about what the world right now. I think we should take the most advantage, especially when we are at the right place at the right time. We are at the middle of. We are at the most. Straits of Malacca is the most busiest straits in the world. We are in the middle between. We are sandwiched between China and India, and I think both countries. I think India is coming up because of their population dividend. And China is also having problem with US. US being very paranoid of their of China coming up, becoming more advanced in technology and whatnot. And as Dr. Sri Muhammad Iqbal said just now, I think we are in the right place for FDIs have been coming in because they have been taking advantage because of the conflict between US and China. And I think the war like Dr. Geoffrey mentioned just now, Prof. Geoffrey mentioned just now, I think the war, there is a possibility it could prolong because you know why? It benefits the war complex, the industrial war complex. I think there is the need for them to prolong the war. Although I'm against war, but I think it's going to be, extended. It's not going to be a easy solution. because I don't think Putin would accept defeat. And unless there is a deal behind the scene, I don't know. But then again, I think the world we are living in is very complex. It has been, I don't know how many times it's been reset. After pandemic, now we have another issue with regards to everybody is focusing on war. It's going to come up. It happened it's happening in Europe. It might happen in our doorstep, in Taiwan or other places. So it's difficult to see, where the world is going to. But of course, like Dr. Kirida mentioned just now, the mega trends are there: digitalization, the world going towards sustainability. The concern about climate change and all those things are running at the background. But we need to deal with the present danger, the clear and present danger that we're going through right now. I think with that, I stop there. I pass back to Dr. Yogesh. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Chairman basically tried to contextualize the whole thing with respect to Malaysia, and he also talked about some of the global challenges which you face and the possibility of a protracted war in Ukraine and Russia. We'll deal with some of the issues later in greater detail. I now invite Dr. Sankara Nambiar to provide his perspective.
First of all, let me thank KSI and Tan Sri in particular for having invited me, Dato Sri also. It's always a great pleasure to be at KSI events. I think I would see 3 points or 3 areas of concern globally. One is, of course, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and I think on most of the points that I'm going to raise, that there would be a lot of overlap with what the previous speakers have been commenting. On Russia-Ukraine, that seems to be the mother of a lot of our problems. The question of energy prices, supply chain disruptions, the impact on food, on semiconductors, a lot of it stems out of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Input for semiconductors comes from Ukraine, feed, animal feed, fertilizer. These countries have, the conflict has a huge bearing on it, and we can see the impact on Malaysia. And also supply chain disruptions. It doesn't look, as has been mentioned, it doesn't look like the conflict is going to end anytime soon. There have actually been comments, observers have raised the possibility, it's a possibility, that it could escalate to a nuclear conflict. MIER has raised this possibility, though it probably might not go all that way, but it quite clearly that there's going to be an escalation, or there is a strong possibility of an escalation, which of course could see an exacerbation, an aggravation of some of the problems that have been mentioned. The second big problem that haunts us is what's happening in the US, and that particularly concerns their fight against inflation. It has also got something to do with what's happening in Russia, Ukraine, but also what's happening entirely within the US. Inflation is at historically high levels. October, November, it was about 7%. It's likely to come down to about 5% in May, but commentators say Going beyond that, trying to achieve something like 2-3% is going to be a long-drawn effort. It's probably going to take a lot of time, and it's going to be more difficult. So I suppose that would mean that we would have to be prepared for the possibility of rate hikes is still very much out there. As it stands, the job numbers in the US aren't too bad. You actually have 1.7 vacancies for every person who is unemployed, so jobs are available. And I think one of the challenges that the Fed would have to work against would be to sort of bring down demand for labor. So there has to be some correction in the labor market in the US before we can see interest rates being more sedate, sort of flattening out. But that is probably going to take some time, and there is in reality it's likely to be a little bit more difficult than I've just mentioned. That there is likely there is the possibility that the Fed might overexert its clout, in which case you might find that the markets, the labor market is more severely affected than it has to be. As it is, consumers in the US are affected by high interest rates, mortgage rates are high, the consumption could possibly be affected, though for the time being it's still holding its own. So there are challenges that the US consumer is faced with, and in the event that this policy action is protracted, you could find contraction, which would result in consumer demand coming down, in which case, once again, you would have global repercussions. Moving on to China, the good thing is, of course, China decided to abandon its super stringent no COVID policy. The opening up has helped a lot, but we're not terribly sure what the property markets are like in the US, in China, whether they would still be functioning in an orderly fashion. The growth rate that is coming out of China is expected to be something like 5%, and I think that gives some room for consolation. Now, also associated with China is the several issues that come out from China. One is, of course, the US-China conflict, and that has consequences, multiple consequences. It stretches to what could possibly happen in Taiwan. I don't think there's any likelihood. Off and on, the Taiwan issue keeps getting raised. And I think aside from tension, anxiety coming out of what could possibly happen in Taiwan, I don't think there's any takeover that's going to happen in Taiwan. But what is more likely, what is real, is this bifurcation as far as technology is concerned, particularly semiconductors with the US CHIP Act, etc. You might find constraints, this conflict extending onto the semiconductor industry. The other issue that would arise because of US-China conflict is, of course, what happens in telecommunications, and that has, once again, obvious implications on Malaysia. it would affect your 5G rollout, the question of cyber security, data privacy, and a whole host of issues. Of course, the bright stars in the global economy are, of course, China, which is supposed to get to reach about 5%, and India, which for the time being seems another star in the horizon, and which is probably going to make a greater ascendancy in the years to come, which is expected to hit about 6% this year. I think both of these economies give us some hope. Now, all of the issues that I have mentioned have consequences on Malaysia. I won't go into all of them. I think Dato wants to take up these, the repercussions and how they affect the region and the national economy in the second round. But I think very quickly, I think the situation is, yes, definitely grim. Haven't talked about what could possibly happen in Iran, the face-off between the US and Iran, and environmental concerns the globe over, the kind of environmental crisis that we could go into. We saw spots of it last year with climate change affecting agricultural production in a number of countries. I think Australia, also India, and the consequent effect that would have on the price of agricultural produce. I'll stop at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Sankar. Very interesting, where you actually mentioned in more detail the impact from the major three risks you talked about, US, China, and also technology. I think this sets the scene for us to go into the next round of discussions. Where I have in mind, as you know, we always talked about the global economy. We, of course, this has got implications for the region and more importantly for Malaysia. Where do you see Malaysia going from here? Is Malaysia ready to face the challenges coming on board in 2023 and beyond that? And are we, because so far with the new government which has come in place, with due respect, given the short time period, we have not seen any clear directions or strategies. Hopefully tomorrow the budget will offer a framework of where the country is going to go in terms of economic priorities, but so far we have not seen something very concrete. We have seen piecemeal announcements and strategies being mentioned. But how do you see Malaysia going forward from here? We talked about so many challenges here arising from interest rates, exchange rates, supply chain, and the mega trends which Dr. Kirida talked about. How do you think Malaysia should respond? Is Malaysia ready for that? What do you think will be the policy priorities for Malaysia? I think that will be the next round of discussions which I pose. And of course, given Dr. Kirida's credentials with respect to the East Asia, I would also like to hear from Dr. Kirida as Dr. Iqbal mentioned, he was surprised how Thailand is poisoning itself, Indonesia is poisoning itself. If you guys give us some detail into how Thailand is poisoning itself to these challenges, it will also give some idea of how countries can begin to respond to these challenges. With this, I open this for further discussion. This time, in all fairness, I allow you to come, whoever comes first. I'll go ahead.
If I may, I'd just like to go first because I don't know enough about Malaysia, so I would defer those to the experts on the stage. But I'd like to share with you, I think, what will be important going forward, and these might be some policies that Malaysia could consider. I think, given the picture that we have laid out for you just now, you probably already saw some of the challenges and also some of the opportunities that are arising, today and also in the future as well. I think one of the things that we have to realize in terms of the government spending is that during the COVID years, most countries have really spent a lot during those years and raised their public debt up, including here Malaysia and in Thailand as well. So I think in the next phase, for example, in Thailand, we are actually seeing a contraction in the budget that has just been released. It's not surprising because in times when the economy is slowing down and no other engines are working, it's the government's role to step up, right? Such as during COVID. But now that recovery looks to be more and more in place, the government could take its feet, as I would say, feet off the accelerator a little bit. But I think what's more important is that you have to target, right? Because although the economy is recovering, but there are still pockets of people or communities that are still suffering from the COVID impacts, or from the impacts from the geopolitical tensions or whatsoever. And it's important that policies are not to be made across the board, but rather to be targeted towards those who are affected. And this is a good way of also spending less and getting more, right? Because you're actually targeting those who are really affected by the pandemic, or those who are really suffering. So one of the things, like for example, many countries are doing, including Thailand, is that although our budget is smaller, but we're targeting more, right? We're targeting more. But with all that said, it's very interesting, Yogis, is that when I talk to people in Thailand, I talk to the government in Thailand, they look to Malaysia as well, right? They said, look at Malaysia, they have already become a high-income country. They must be doing something right. We should look to them. So I think all of us are looking towards each other and seeing what each other is doing right, which is great because we're sharing good experiences so that we can develop as a region together. As Professor said, most of the trade is happening here is within ASEAN itself, right? So it's a good opportunity here. I just want to share with you two more things that I think will be important going forward. Is of course is the digitalization policy in any of the countries, because this is going to be a big trend going forward. Thailand was the first country in ASEAN to have 5G. And now it has 5G in all areas of the East Economic Corridor, for example, which is this big high-tech industrial zone that the government is promoting. And that does attract a lot of multinationals to Thailand as well, because the digital infrastructure is strong there. So I think this is one of the things, if the government wants to invest in infrastructure going forward, is the digital infrastructure. They'll be important. And the second thing is, of course, on this issue of climate change, right? Of climate change. Energy, clean energy will be the next, will be the next big thing. And I'm not only talking about electrical vehicles, but I'm also talking about how you generate electricity, because in the future, there will be more and more demand for clean energy, as many companies, as yourselves are striving towards, right, net zero, carbon footprint. You will be asked, right, to provide your carbon footprint, and if the electricity is still generated from non-renewable, it'll be very difficult to justify your lower carbon footprint. So that will be something that will be important going forward as well in the energy policy of any government. I think I will end there for this round. Thank you.
Can I comment on this? In terms of the prospects for Malaysia 2023, I think it's quite important that we look at what has happened in the last 3 years before we got where we are now. And I think it's very important that we recognize the devastation that has been caused by economic policy in Malaysia over the last 3 years. We've had 2 years of recession, followed by an inflationary boom. And that has caused a great deal of harm to very many people. And I think looking forward into 2023, hopefully that will go away. So we already know that we won't see, for example, another EPF withdrawal, which will be very good, actually, for people who are struggling with their pensions. Perhaps we will see the possibility of readdressing that issue to rebuild people's pensions in Malaysia, because that's a very important structural problem for the country. We have an aging population. I'm part of that. I'm also an EPF member. So we are all worried about how that will affect the economy in the long term. In terms of the immediate macroeconomic indicators, we expect that we won't have that extraordinary and almost inexplicable boom that we had last year, 8.7%. We can explain it, but we can't explain it in good terms. And we will move to a much more stable form of economic growth, probably between 4 and 5% is the consensus. So if there isn't any significant external shock or any significant domestic shock, that's the type of sustainable economic growth trajectory that we should be aiming for. Similarly, when it comes to inflation, we have peaked in inflation back in August. I think Shankar is at about 4.7% in August, and now it's clearly coming down. It is elevated, that's for sure. Prices tend to go up quickly and come down slowly. We call this downward stickiness. So the cost of living will remain elevated, but the rate of inflation will be slower. We expect that to happen during the year. And we will see a different trajectory in terms of government policy, I think, a move away from a long list of handouts and a long list of projects and a laundry list of ideas for particular focus or political groups, because Prime Minister's won the election, so he doesn't need to do that, right? So we will move, I think, toward a much more stable budget and a much more stable fiscal position and a much more stable economic environment with elevated but slower inflation, lower but more stable economic growth. And what that means, I think, for interest rates, for the OPR, is that the surprise pause at the last meeting, which wasn't a surprise for me, I predicted it perfectly, by the way, but I don't see that there will be much pressure for Bank Negara to increase interest rates any further. Perhaps another 0.25%. There is a genuine debate, I think, amongst economists as to whether the fundamental underlying rate for OPR should be 2.75 or 3%. That's a genuine discussion that we're having. But we don't, well, I certainly don't expect that there would be any prolonged increase in OPR beyond that, probably in that range. And that would be that we would have a very stable economic environment, relatively speaking, domestically at least. So absent any significant external shock, 2023 for me will be a much happier time, because economists are happy not when the economy is booming or when the economy is collapsing, but when the economy is stable. That's what makes us, the three of us, sit around smiling. That's what makes us smile, when everything is in equilibrium, everything is stable, and everything is predictable. The trend's your friend, right? Once we can see the economy moving toward trend, that's what makes us happy, because then policy can focus on the long-term reform agenda. And I think you're right, Dato'. People are very impatient to see the reformasi reforms, the reform agenda. We haven't seen it yet. So we hope that after tomorrow, when the basic financial situation, the basic financial situation, the budget has been settled, that the government can then say, this is the groundwork, these are the foundations, now we can move on to the reform agenda. And then that will be what will be exciting for us, a stable economy and a reform agenda. That would be good.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, Prof. So the important thing is not high-speed train rates of growth, but rather a stable, more certain kind of growth rate of 4 to 5% is kind of acceptable. And that's what most of us are looking out for. Yeah, great.
I liked Prof. Geoffrey's characterization of the economy just now. It's very smoothing. It's almost Cinderella-like.
Very good.
And then we'll be happy about it. Yeah. Let's hope it works out that way. But a couple of things continue from what we were talking about early on and the kind of repercussions they have on the Malaysian economy. For instance, you could see implications on almost every area. And if you take, for instance, the conflict between China, or the tension between China and the US, that of course poses lots of problems, but also it gives us opportunities. And one of the ways in which we could benefit, we might possibly benefit, is the inflow of FDI into the country. Both from China itself as well as from other countries which might want to diversify and pull out of China or have an additional facility in Malaysia. And that itself gives rise to a number of issues. For instance, do we have the right framework, the right set of facilities and services that can support FDI? The whole climate has to be revisited. Do we have the right industrial estates? Are these the kind of industrial estates that investors are looking to? Can they come into the country and start running the moment they are here? Are the utilities that are offered up to expectations, and so on and so forth? So the game as far as our attractiveness as a center for FDI has to be pushed out. And I'd like to comment on something that actually Prof. Geoffrey mentioned in an article of his several weeks back. He said that we couldn't still go along with the narrative that Malaysia will be the hub for investment in ASEAN. I think you said something to that effect. I would very much agree with that, because I think at the time when Najib was talking about it, and that was before RCEP was signed, he was looking at Malaysia as a hub via RCEP. That doesn't hold very strongly these days, because I think Indonesia and Vietnam have their own capabilities. They are competing, though perhaps at a different level, but they are competing. So now I suppose we have multiple spokes coming out of ASEAN rather than one hub. Now, of course, with all these challenges, the challenges that we mentioned earlier, I think it becomes more important to step up to reinvigorate trade, and that's, I suppose, where FTAs come in. And the story on FTAs, I think, is going to be very different than what it was before. It's certainly not going to be solely on trade issues. Other issues are going to weigh heavily, perhaps more heavily than trade issues. For instance, if we wanted to get into an FTA with EU, I think they'll want to look at what our record on reforestation is, what we're doing about our wildlife. They'll want to look at our carbon emissions, how fast or to what extent we're moving towards embracing the green economy. And I think human rights, labor rights is going to be increasingly important. So while we have all these external stresses, sources of stress, I think there has to be a great deal of resilience that has to come from within the country in the form of the kind of FDI framework, facilities, etc., that attractiveness that we are going to build in terms of how we're looking ahead in terms of trade. And I think SMEs have a big role to play in this, and also the government in terms of conscientizing SMEs on what they or how they should be prepared. Without getting into a discussion on fiscal policy, without getting into a full-blown discussion on that, I think I very much agree with what Dato Yogesh has said on the direction for the country going forward. Yes, you have had statements coming in dribs and drabs on various issues. For instance, that you need to have corruption, that you should have zero tolerance for corruption, that you should government spending has to be prudent, there shouldn't be leakages, etc. But a consolidated vision on our fiscal direction has not yet been enunciated, and perhaps we don't have to wait too long. We get to know that tomorrow. But also, as a country, what is the vision going forward? Is it going to be a very different vision? Is it going to be some embellishment of what was mentioned in RMK 12? I think that's something that we look forward to hearing. And I think also, aside from the big picture, and I think we recognize the problems on the big picture side. We know that cost of living is an issue. We don't seem to acknowledge the importance of social safety nets. And I think that has been raised by various economists, Jeff being one of them. But I think it's becoming increasingly crucial, something that has to be attended to with some immediacy. Access to healthcare. I mean, I don't know, the government has been dragging its feet for decades on healthcare financing, but I think as a matter of urgency, these issues have to be looked at. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. I think he raised some very critical points. First thing, of course, moving forward, we talked about competitiveness, the way forward, basically because you must still be able to attract the FDIs. You need to have the ecosystem. You talk about trade. Today, trade is not trade alone. It's got accompanying issues, especially when you talk about trading with Europe and the US and developed countries. It's just not trade alone, but accompanying it is your compliance to environment, your compliance with reforestation, your compliance with carbon footprint, you know. So there are a lot of things. Trade goes beyond just trade alone. So we have to really look at those things. And of course, a very important point, I think Prof. Geoffrey also talked about aging society. So social safety net is another issue which you need to look at. Some of the very important points I think we'll discuss if we have time again.
Thank you. I think most of the points that have been said is more or less, valid and should be taken seriously by the policymakers. The thing is, in the context of implementation is always an issue. So we have another 6 states election in the next 6 months, and because of that, I think there are certain policies that should be done, especially with regards to increasing the revenue base, like introducing the GST or consumption tax. It will not be happening, and that is also something of concern to some people, with regards to the fact that we are over-dependent on. We are still considered a resource-based economy, basically, because we have, huge amount of resources, commodities, oil and gas, palm oil, rubber, whatnot. So if we do not have a very a strong commitment in making sure that we come up with a broader based tax system in order to ensure that the government has the money, has the funds to finance economic growth, then we are in trouble. Because oil prices is not going to stay above $80 for long. As long as there's war, of course, there's possibility of that remaining above $80, you know. Of course, it will definitely be good for the Malaysian economy because 20-30% of government revenue comes from oil and gas. Petronas made about $80 billion profit, I think, last year, something like that, you know. And everybody's happy. A lot of other oil and gas, my friends are getting like, you know, bonuses like never before. I don't know how long it will last. Yeah, so I mean, at the end of the day, there is a need because there is also the concern of leakages. The GST will definitely help to remove, bring the grey economy into the mainstream. A lot of people are not paying tax, and in fact, those who are employed, about 11, I think about 8-9 million people, only like, you know, how many percent are less than, you know, really paying tax. So those are a major concern, you know. We need to raise, the other thing is we need to raise income levels. You know, companies are not willing to do so. Most of you are employers, I know. But, you know, are you willing to raise, your employees' income, right? Given the fact that cost of living is going up. Are you compassionate enough to do so? And then you compare with, you know, then you have to look at your bottom line. No, I'm not going to do this year, you know. Wait until the government give more incentive. How the government is going to give more incentive? They need more money. So they need to introduce some kind of a broader tax system. Or the other option is to tax the rich, right? So most of you are, I think, above, higher upper middle income. I would guess, and of course some of you may be T20 or T10. So most of you are not going to pay full tax because you have the means to, you know, not to say avoid, but to, you know, to manage your tax. But people who are M40 or B40, or maybe B40, they don't pay tax, but M40 are going to suffer the most if the government introduce higher tax for the higher bracket income. So my point here is there is a need to quicken the policies to make sure that, you know, the country is, you know, prepared for the future. I do respect our fellow panelists' point of view that, you know, we need a country to grow. If the country goes, I think tomorrow the government is going to announce, I think, between 4 to 5% GDP growth for this year. That's expected. But what about next year? What about the year after? You know, because we need to see that the next generation, those people who are graduate, to get you know, a better job, better income, or else I think you know, there's going to be trouble. The other thing is the currency. Our currency is hugely undervalued. Of course, it's going to benefit the exporters, you know, because our exports are cheap. Our hotels, 5-star hotels, are relatively the cheapest in the world in US dollar term. So of course, but at the end of the day, are we going to be, you know, be known as a country that provides cheap labor, cheap stuff, and all those things, you know, cheap services? You know, at the end of the day, how are we going to achieve high income if we, as Malaysians, or as, you know, are happy with everything cheap? You know, if possible, they want free, right? So these are the things that we need to think about. We need to have a high income, a strong currency for that matter. You know, I think a lot of the millennials haven't experienced a ringgit of 2.5 against the dollar, right? When was the last time? It was back in the mid-90s, you know. and almost 1.5 against the Deutsche Mark, you know. So now we are far behind as in terms of how we're going to attract, you know, talents. You know, we may pay a 5-figure salary, but in ringgit term, in US dollar term, or even Sing dollar term, it's not that much. You know, that's why you see a lot of our young people are working in Singapore. In fact, even in Thailand, you know, those are places, even China, you know, where they are attracting Malaysian talents. You know, so that's my concern. I think the KPI for politicians is the ringgit. I might be a bit idiosyncratic in that part, but I think if the ringgit is still grossly undervalued, I think that reflects the government's policy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Suhaimie. I think two very important points to take away. First is, of course, the government wants to do more. It has to raise its revenue. Of course, it's really timely to look at the reformation of our tax system, not only in terms of the broad-based tax, but you have to look at all the incentive schemes and the overlapping fiscal incentives and tax incentives which investors get. I think the whole reform is very important. I think the reform started very much even when I was a government, but it has really not taken off and it's not materialized. Many times the civil servants know what to do, but actually the political will is very, very important, which is holding back all these reforms. I think very important point. Of course, the other is about talent drain. That's a very important issue. If you want to move forward, Malaysia wants to become another important player in the region and the world. The talent is the most important thing you need to have. Right. Having done all this, now I think it's time for me to open up to delegates. We have about 20 minutes. What I would request is welcome you to introduce yourself and keep your questions precise and comment short. You may direct specific questions to specific panelists if you need, or if not, open up to all the panelists. Now I invite the floor. Please use the mics. The mics are there. And
Hello. Good morning, everyone. My name is Alex. I'm the CDO of a Good Taste Group of Restaurant from the retail. So having the opportunity to visit Taiwan last week, actually, I'm happy to see where Malaysia is at right now in terms of advancement and also where Malaysia has, surpassed, I think. So I'm very happy to see that. Two questions, actually. One that's open for the panel. Being from the retail industry, what do you think, what are our chances of Malaysia brand in the retail in tackling the global market, especially China and USA? I'd just like to hear your opinion. That's question one that's open to the panel. Question two to Mr. Firdaus, that you mentioned about the pay. I totally agree. I'm also the Treasurer General for the Malaysian Retail Chain Association. However, one thing that I would like to point out is also on the Anti-Profiteering Act, whereby it's also where we come from the retail industry, our income is from the retails, from our sales of products. But it's counterproductive when we would like to increase the salary, now it's 1,005, in terms of going up to a high income standard. Of course, we are aiming at 3,000, but we are not allowed to increase our products. So how do we come about that? Thank you very much.
Mr. Alex, can you repeat your first question, please?
The first question is about our strength, Malaysian brands, retail brands. Where do you think, what's our chances in tackling the global market, especially in China or in the US? Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, but you're not going to like the answer to my question, but I will tell you the truth as I see it. The reputation of Malaysia during the last 2 years has plummeted. And it's plummeted for multiple reasons. First, of course, the corruption, sending a former prime minister to prison, does not help Malaysia's reputation in terms of governance. but then also the ban from Indonesia on hiring workers from Indonesia. And the reason why they did that is because of modern day slavery. And so if you have this reputation globally, that really is going to cause, and you must acknowledge it because it is the truth of it, that is going to cause a very significant negative impact on the perception of international purchasers, buyers, tourists, whatever they are, investors, on the brand of Malaysia. Of course it is, because it's shameful. So of course it's going to damage your brand. And this is one of the reasons why the Prime Minister has come along in respect of foreign workers, for example, and has insisted on this issue of agent fees and removing the agents, because this is a source of modern day slavery. And then you have employers saying, we cannot increase the salary of the foreign workers, but then at the same time, they're paying 25,000 ringgit for the permit. 25,000 ringgit divided by 12 is 2,000 ringgit a month. They can raise the salary just by not paying it to the agent. They can afford to do it. In the palm oil sector, there was 20 billion ringgit of palm oil rotting on the trees. And then they're saying, we can't find the people to cut it. If you raise their salary, they will come and they will cut it for you. So it's exactly what Suhaimie was saying. We have to recognize you have to raise people's income. And then when one of the first things that employer groups did for the new government, when the new government came in, was to petition the new government to delay the minimum wage. This is shameful, absolutely shameful. This is a policy to keep poor people poor. And then if you ask the question, what does this do in terms of Malaysia's reputation? I'll tell you bluntly, it's shocking and bad. You should be ashamed of it. And that's why the Prime Minister is doing something to change it.
Thank you.
Prof.
Question on wage.
Yeah, on the wage issue regarding your dilemma, whereby because you are stuck with the complying with the Anti-Profiteering Act and raising the income because it will reduce your margin, right? Or even, maybe, may not even have profit at all. But to be honest with you, I think these things are just a matter of creativity, at the end of the day. I may sound very, iffy, but I think a lot of businesses, they succeed because they manage to overcome regulatory hurdles, challenges of, either you do, more investment on, tools to improve productivity, automation, all these things. Of course, it does have to come up with, you have to come up with the upfront capital, but, as they say, you spend more now, you spend less later, right? So those are the things. I think it's up to you, your creativity. You are businessmen, you are entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs are supposed to be, creative in order to reduce, costs and overcome any challenges, be it regulatory, be it, external, be it a competition, blah, blah, blah. So I think we need to learn more. We need to have more knowledge, rather than depending, on government handouts, incentives, and all those things. I think in the beginning, it's okay. But as you progress along the way, you have to be more, creative. That's all I can say. At the end of the day, the government is there to protect consumers, and also at the same time, they want the SMEs or micro SMEs to excel, to have a very conducive business environment for them to thrive. You know? So we either we take advantage of it or and deal with it. That's why it's not what happened to you; it's what you do about it. That's all I can say.
Just like to add a little bit to what the previous panelists have said. I was part of one of the members of the many committees that were contributing to the third industrial master plan. And the question that came up back then, quite some time ago, the question that came up back then was, how do we have Malaysian brands penetrating the global markets? And the instance at that point that was cited was Royal Selangor. I think the problem is still valid today. I mean, the fact that you have raised it clearly shows that this is something that you are grappling with today. And you see that there are international retailers, the Japanese companies, Family Mart, etc., which are penetrating into other markets. But I mean, so on one hand, you need to have the right product, marketing, etc., and that's something which works at the level of the business. But also, the environment is very different today than it was at the time Third Industrial Master Plan was being drafted. You have seen recently what happened with Top Glove, and the way they treated their workers was not acceptable. The US did what it did. So I think these kinds of perceptions, not just perceptions, more than perceptions, will have to be dealt with, and they will have to be dealt with proactively. I had alluded to that when I was talking of FTAs, but it also impinges on the question that you have asked. And on the question of labor, I think those days of cheap labor, modern day slavery are fast coming to an end. It's pretty hard getting workers from India these days. Go into any Indian restaurant and you probably find more workers from some other part of the world. It's called an Indian restaurant, but you find workers from some other part of the world other than India. They're not going to come from Bangladesh. Bangladesh is doing pretty well. And it's getting difficult to get them from Indonesia. So I think you know where the screws are. You know where they have to be tightened and where they have to be loosened. So I think businesses and agencies in the country will have to adapt to changing circumstances.
Thank you, Prof. Dr. Nambia. Can I, other question?
Hi, morning. I first wanted to commend distinguished speakers for a very, very interesting, insightful discussion.
Could you introduce yourself first, please?
Oh, sorry. Hi, my name is PL. I'm in the space of helping Malaysian companies to internationalize. So there are certain observations which I would like to offer here as well, and also get your thoughts. But I wanted to also commend Dr. Kirida for your very animated way of explaining something a very bleak outlook being explained so jovially. That made my day. So thank you for that. So there's a few things which I think just based on this discussion, which I feel that in Malaysia itself, we don't usually have very open and honest discussions with regards to our own challenges at home, right? And I also wanted to ask Dr. Kirida in terms of being in a single race country, how is that like? So in Malaysia, what I've observed is that I feel that there are three main challenges that we face. And the first is around corruption, the second is racism, and the third is implementation. So on the first point, corruption, many of you have actually raised this point around how we need to better our governance systems, and to Dr. Geoffrey's point earlier, with the ways of how our policies are implemented and money on the table and how we treat our foreign labor, etc., right? So the issue of corruption is in a way related to this point of racism, in which this is the elephant in the room that we often not talk about. So case in point, 1.5 million civil servants, 95 or 98% are Malays. Look at all of our GLCs, majority, more than 90% are Malays. And then you look into the private sector, if you're a Chinese company, then you're all Chinese. If you're in the insurance sector, financial sector, if your company is Chinese, you're all Chinese, if you're Indians, you're all Indians. So this is an issue not just from the way how we behave and the combination of what happens to our economy and how it affects our business decisions, policy making, and therefore implementation. We are weak at implementing our own policies. We are also very weak at punishing the ones who are at fault. So case in point again, back to corruption. Only Najib, I'm very happy that he's in jail, but I'm also very happy that our governance system has finally upheld itself, right? And so we need to see more of this happening, and I also don't see enough business leaders speaking up about these things. So Malaysians are very resilient because we don't get much help from the government. So I would like to also disagree with Mr. Wan's point to answer this gentleman's question earlier, to say to be more creative and to be more entrepreneurial. There's a lot more depth to that discussion, but I will leave it at that. So my point is that given these three main challenges happening in Malaysia, these are the things which we need to first address. You know, what are the things that's happening at home before we want to think about how can Malaysian business forward our brands, etc., and play at the global level. So I think some of these topics, especially on racism, is never addressed, and I think it's also avoided because then it keeps people who are in power, the elites, the benefactors, the beneficiaries, comfortable. So this is just a point which I thought I wanted to hear from the distinguished speakers' thoughts as well and comments. And also Dr. Kirida, being a Thai person, how Thailand is now the second largest economy in ASEAN, surpassing Malaysia. Of course, by population, yes, but also you guys have done a brilliant job. And Malaysia should really think hard and deep about why are we falling behind amongst all these other ASEAN countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gail, for your comments. Thank you very much for the very frank and open comments. I will get Kirida to respond first.
Thank you so much for your comments. Actually, I must say that, you know, this is one of the most frank comments I've heard in the many forums I've been to, and especially in Thailand, you will never hear comments like that. So when you talk about openness, you know, we are actually probably more shy and also more respectful to our elders. I don't know what the reasons are, but we don't, you know, express ourselves that openly. So to be honest with you, I think, you know, Thailand has a lot to learn from Malaysia. We have the same issues, right? We have corruption, right? We have, we might not have racism, but what we have is that a big group of elites who control the country and who are, you know, mostly have monopolistic power, I would say, and are very close to the government, no matter which government comes, because they pay they pay to all the governments, you know, who come and who, you know, would, you know, have the potential to be government. So there is that issue as well, right? In Thailand. So I think our problems are similar. Implementation, you know, it's also very difficult. You know, in Thailand, you know, the government agencies find it difficult to implement because we work in silos, different ministries are different. So I think we have similar issues to deal with. With that said, I'd just like to also go back to the first gentleman's comment. I think the strength of our countries are actually with the private sector. I agree with you that the government might not be able to help us much. They might be able to lay infrastructure, right, help targeted groups. I think that's the role of the government. But I strongly believe that the private sector in both countries are very strong. We would not have gotten as far as we did, you know, if the private sector themselves are not very strong. Just to quickly end by saying, in the retail sector, for example, right, there's a big Thai group called the Central Group that have really, you know, been successful in going out. They bought Selfridges in the US. They've bought you know, a grade A department store in Germany. Of course, they don't use Central brand, but use the original brands. But they use the know-how and the expertise that they have built, you know, over the past 60 years in Thailand. And of course, knowing the partners, knowing who do you joint venture with to understand the regulations in those countries are also very important. One of the lessons I learned from the Central Group is when they went and established a department store in Indonesia, for example. They didn't use their brand, but it was an Indonesia brand. But because they didn't really understand the regulations there, and regulations there could change, from week to week. So just right before they opened, the government told them that, oh, you have to have more Indonesian products in your department store. So they couldn't open on time, for example. So these are things I think are important for the private sector to learn, is to find a really good partner that understand the regulations of those countries as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kirida. I think what we have to do is, we are running short of time. I've got very strict instructions that we should conclude by 11:45. That means we are left about 7 minutes. I'm so sorry I cannot invite any more questions from the floor. But what I want to do is, I think it's a very interesting comment made by Ms. Kela. I'm sure the panelists here want to have a chance to respond. So I'm just going to give each of them a minute to respond to that comment, as well as to say anything you want to do in besides that in 1 minute.
May I have the first one? Okay. Thank you very much for the very frank comment. I really love it. My apologies if I do have I'm given the wrong message here with regards to the entrepreneurs who are doing their best to to provide growth, productivity, and for the economy of the nation to contribute. 80% of GDP growth comes from the hard work from you guys. So I do find that we are in a conundrum actually, whereby the country is if not being governed or not being led the right way, we are going to go down the dumps. So I think it starts with education. It starts with early education. The government should focus on that. And of course, at home also we have to do something about it, to tell our kids that this is not the right thing to do. The problem with our country is that our leaders. It's not because our country, the racial issue. This is created by the elitists, the people who are in power, who are paranoid that they're going to lose their control. So be mindful of that. So do not be too concerned when we think that we actually coexist for the longest time, although we are, we have a racial background. I'm half Chinese anyway, so I think at the end of the day, we need to understand that things are not as bad as you think. It's just that it's created by certain small group of people to ensure that they are staying in power. That's it. I end with that. Thank you very much.
Putting the time. Just a minute.
Dr. Yogesh, I'm sure you know, I can't address this topic in a minute. So what I'll do is I'll sidestep the challenging questions that the lady just asked. You need more than a minute, and you don't just need a minute. Now, after that, you need to have lots of action to follow up on it. I'm not up to that challenge. I just want to pick up on one last point that my colleague once mentioned, education. I think that itself is a huge issue. I do some part-time teaching. I used to teach long time back, and I must tell you that the standards are atrocious, absolutely atrocious, even at master's level. Quite often you can't understand a word of what they are writing, and there is pressure to pass them. And this happens not just private universities, public universities. I have experience with both kinds of institutions. So I don't know where you're going to start with education, with racism. Where I don't know. That's a grim way of ending.
Okay, thanks. Let me, I know we want to move on quickly, so I will just make 3 comments. First, the question of race. I've been here for 20 years. Clearly, I'm not a Malaysian. I just don't buy this argument that every problem is a consequence of race. It's just not true from my own analysis. It's a question of class, a bit what Suhaimie was saying. It's a question of who is in control. It doesn't matter about your race. If you look for an explanation just with race, that will be your explanation. But if you look at it in terms of multiple indicators that will deliver a problem, you find class, education, location, connection, all of these things in a multivariate sense then have some power in explaining the problems. Yeah, and I know within the civil service, yes, it's dominated by Malays, but there are some excellent Indian civil servants, some former former civil servants who are excellent, because I worked with a little bit with Datuk at the EPU, and there are excellent civil servants in the EPU, wonderful, from all races. So my view is that's not the single explanation. Second, on the role of government and the size of government, I had a little bit of an interaction with the World Bank when they said Malaysia's government revenue and government spending in Malaysia is very low. And I said, good. Good. The lower it is, the less corruption there will be. The less money they have, the less wastage there will be. And I also made the point that it's not the government's money. This is a transfer from the private sector to the government, and the government spends it. Better that, because I agree with what the thrust of your argument, better that this money is left with the private sector and let the private sector generate wealth, because the private sector is better at generating the wealth. So the smaller the government is, the better it is. Let the private sector keep the money and generate the wealth. And the final thing is that we have a new government now, please remember. We have a new government with a new prime minister, and he has already begun to address these issues of race and corruption and wastage. And he's been very clear. I have never heard this in 20 years from previous prime ministers. He knows what the problem is, and he knows how to solve it. And that's why you must support, if not him personally or him politically, you must support that agenda, because that agenda is very important in delivering the prosperity that I think Malaysia still has available to it.
Thank you so much for a very crisp response from Prof. Geoffrey. I'm really my sincere apologies. I know many of you are getting out of the seats to ask more questions, but let it be. I presume all of the panelists will be out there for lunch. You can still talk to them while you're having lunch. I think that should be okay. And let me I just got a minute with me, and let me just, by way of conclusion, so some of the key points is coming out from the discussion today. The global economy, as we know, is going to grow, but at a decelerated phase. And we are going to have continued challenges, which you saw in 2022, certainly being inflation, cost is not going to run away. Maybe these are going to be more deflated. We are also going to see a protracted and maybe further escalation of war in the Ukraine and Russia, and that could bring other repercussions. And the point about taking away from Malaysia, many of the issues were raised, and we talked about what Malaysia should do in terms of priority, and a few things came out very importantly was to increase revenue, to address the fiscal position, while ensuring that there is continued growth, as well as focusing on equitable distribution of wealth, addressing those who really require, and the point of targeting, while you can reduce budget, but you target the people who actually require the assistance. We also talked about aging society, the social safety net we have to address, trade investment are very, very important. Competition becomes a very key thing in moving forward. The other thing is being inclusive. We realize that 90% of our business establishments are SMEs, and 80% of them are micro enterprises. You need to ensure that they are part and parcel of the growth agenda and the growth story. So, I mean, assistance has been given to them. And the other very important point which came out even now is the question of governance, addressing corruption, improving reputation of Malaysia in the global world is very important. And last but not least, the global trends. We have to be in tandem with the global trends, digitalization, climate change. We need to respond to that very strongly. With that, I'd like to thank the panelists this morning and also delegates this morning for the excellent participation. And thank you so much. I hand it over back to you guys.
Thank you so much, panel. Let's give them a round of applause, gentlemen.